Usually when we look at a legal document or a court case, we expect to see um, a map.
Right, like clear lines.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Clear lines, specific coordinates, a direct logical path from like an action to a consequence. But sometimes you look at a case and the map just makes zero sense.
It's totally broken.
Right. It's like trying to use a compass in the middle of a massive magnetic storm. The needle is just spinning wildly, and the logical terrain you're looking for just isn't there.
Because what you're experiencing in those moments is the sudden realization that you are looking for standard legal logic. But what you are actually witnessing is a collision of, well, invisible fundamental forces.
Yeah.
You're seeing a psychological battlefield that has simply been masked as a courtroom.
And that is exactly the kind of storm we are stepping into today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are looking at a really fascinating stack of source material today. We have a series of extensive analyses generated by various advanced psychological modeling AIs, so ChatGPT, Copilot, DeepSeek, Gemini, Qwen.
The whole squad.
All right. And they're all examining a highly specific, very complex legal case from China, the Chen Jingwon case.
It is a wild one.
It really is. And our mission today isn't to rehash a standard legal debate or get bogged down in, statutory minutia. We are going to unpack this case entirely through the lens of motivation and emotion psychology.
Which is such a cool way to look at it.
Right. The goal is to help you, the listener, understand how these psychological frameworks explain the massive clash between individual behavior and institutional power.
Exactly.
But before we jump in, a really crucial disclaimer.
Yes, very important.
Because we are looking at some heavily charged political documents today regarding the Chinese judicial system and the actions of a Chinese citizen. I want to be incredibly clear right up front. Our goal here isn't to take political sides.
Right. We aren't endorsing the viewpoints contained in these files.
Not at all. We are strictly putting on our psychology hats to see what makes these systems and individuals tick. We're just impartially conveying the structural psychological ideas contained in the original source material.
Impartiality is key here. So with that framework in place, the facts of the case established in the sources, they set up quite a mystery.
Yeah, tell us about Dr. Chen.
So Dr. Chen Jingwon is a researcher. He holds a PhD in physics, specifically focusing on nonlinear complex systems.
Okay, so a very smart guy.
Very. And he was arrested in his home by Kunming police. The formal charge against him was, quote, picking quarrels and provoking trouble, which is a serious criminal offense in the system.
And his alleged crime was what, exactly?
Using a VPN to occasionally retweet articles, political commentary, and art on Twitter, which included some content from the U.S. Embassy.
Wait, just retweeting?
Just retweeting. And for that, he was ultimately sentenced to 1 year and 8 months in prison.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the real mystery here isn't just the literal application of the law. It's the massive psychological disconnect.
Right. How do you get from A to B?
Exactly. How does an isolated academic sitting at his desk at home reading tweets turn into a major criminal conviction? To understand that leap, we first have to understand why Dr. Chen was retweeting in the first place.
And why the authorities cared so much.
Right. Which takes us straight into motivation psychology.
Yeah, when you run his behavior through the psychological modeling, a very clear profile emerges. It's rooted heavily in what psychologists call self-determination theory.
Okay, I've heard of that, but remind me how it works.
So this theory posits that human behavior is driven by 3 basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Got it.
And Dr. Chen's actions were almost purely intrinsic. Because he's a complex systems scientist, he operates with a remarkably high epistemic motivation.
Meaning he just wants to learn.
Exactly. It's a profound internal drive to seek truth, explore uncertainty, and understand how the world works. He wasn't retweeting for external rewards.
He wasn't trying to become an influencer.
Not at all. He wasn't seeking fame. He wasn't trying to monetize a following. The sources note he had fewer than 100 followers and almost 0 interaction.
Wow.
He was simply building a personal intellectual archive.
So the behavior itself, like the act of collecting and categorizing the information, was the entire reward. He didn't need an audience.
Right. The psychological analyses point out that he had a low need for cognitive closure.
What does that mean in normal terms?
Basically, it means he had a very high tolerance for ambiguity. He didn't need information to be neatly packaged as black or white, true or false.
Oh, okay.
He collected diverse viewpoints just to study them, like a biologist collecting different species of beetles. But then you contrast this with the judicial system's motivation.
Right, the system arresting him.
Yeah, the sources describe the system as highly extrinsic. It is driven almost entirely by risk avoidance, order maintenance, and intense top-down control. They operate with a massive high need for cognitive closure.
So ambiguity is a threat to them.
A huge threat. The modeling highlights that the legal officials were motivated by heavy external pressure. One prosecutor even admitted to a defense lawyer that they had strict orders from above stating they, quote, must make it an ironclad case.
Wow. It makes me think of a dynamic where you have two people who literally cannot see the world the same way.
How do you mean?
Well, imagine Dr. Chen is a quiet, dedicated librarian, right? Happily organizing a vast, eclectic collection of books purely for the love of knowledge. He just wants to see how the ideas connect.
Okay, I like this.
Then suddenly his library gets raided by a security guard. But this security guard's only job metric, his entire professional motivation, is keeping the building completely empty to avoid any potential fire hazards.
Yeah, that's a brilliant analogy.
The librarian and the security guard are operating in completely different universes. The librarian sees an archive, and the guard just sees kindling.
Yeah, and that structural psychological mismatch is the core of the conflict. It's not just a disagreement over the facts of what Dr. Chen did. The system literally lacks the psychological framework to understand a behavior that doesn't have an external, goal-oriented, disruptive agenda.
Because the system desperately needs certainty and control to function, it completely misreads the academic's intrinsic curiosity.
Exactly. And because the system operates entirely on that extrinsic control, it has to find a way to make Dr. Chen's actions fit into its worldview.
Which leads us directly to how the court justified his conviction, bringing us to a massive psychological bias.
Yeah.
There's this wild detail from the court's judgment in the sources. The court explicitly argued that because Dr. Chen has a high level of education because he holds a PhD, he should have known right from wrong.
Right.
Therefore, his actions retweeting these posts must have been intentionally malicious.
What's fascinating here is that the psychological modeling flags this as a textbook instance of the fundamental attribution error.
Okay, wait.
Which was then compounded by a motivational attribution bias.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. Fundamental attribution error. Is that like when I assume someone who cut me off in traffic is just a fundamentally terrible, selfish person?
Yes, exactly.
Completely ignoring the situational context that maybe they're rushing to the emergency room? I attribute their action to an internal character flaw rather than external circumstances.
That traffic scenario is the perfect everyday example. Our brains use the fundamental attribution error as an evolutionary shortcut to judge threats quickly.
Okay, so how does that map onto a court of law?
Well, in this case, the system completely ignored the objective situational context. Dr. Chen is an isolated individual, an edge node on a digital network just collecting data in his home.
Right.
Instead, because the court couldn't fathom his non-destructive intrinsic motives, they projected a destructive extrinsic motive onto him.
Ah, I see.
They looked at his PhD and assumed, well, if he is highly intelligent and he is doing something we perceive as a threat to our order, he must be doing it intentionally to cause danger.
Wait. If the court uses his high intelligence and his education as the actual proof of his malicious intent, doesn't that fundamentally weaponize education?
It absolutely does.
It's basically stating you are smart, so any mistake you make or any ambiguous area you explore cannot be an accident. It must actually be an intentional crime. That is a terrifying bias to institutionalize.
It is deeply problematic, and to understand why the officials leaned into that bias, we have to look at the immense psychological pressure they were under.
Okay, what kind of pressure?
The modeling introduces the concept of cognitive dissonance. Picture the internal state of these officials. They are looking at the evidence. They know the act is incredibly minor, just a guy with zero reach saving things on the internet.
Right.
But simultaneously, they have intense top-down orders to secure a serious criminal conviction.
So their brain is experiencing, like, physical distress. They're doing something they know on some level is disproportionate, but they have to do it anyway to keep their jobs.
Exactly. The brain hates that friction. To stop that mental pain, to resolve the dissonance, the officials used moral disengagement.
Oh, interesting.
They diffused their personal responsibility by leaning on the hierarchy. The classic, I'm just following orders from above defense. But more importantly, They engaged in a shame rage spiral.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of that spiral. How does a prosecutor get from, I'm just following orders, to actual rage against an academic?
Well, think about the power dynamics. These officials are sitting across from a highly educated complex systems physicist.
Intimidating.
Exactly. On some level, they might feel intellectually outmatched or aware of the absurdity of the situation. That creates a subtle feeling of shame or inadequacy.
And the brain doesn't like shame.
No, the human ego protects itself from shame by converting it into righteous anger. To neutralize their own guilt about prosecuting him, their brains had to invent a monster.
Wow.
They labeled him a sophisticated threat, a bad actor. Once he is a monster, punishing him feels psychologically justified and heroic rather than morally compromising.
That is so dark. We've looked at the motivations driving the actions, but what happens when these deeply conflicting motives actually collide in a high-pressure environment?
Like an interrogation room.
Yeah, we're talking about an interrogation room, a prison cell, and a courtroom. This is where we shift gears from motivation psychology to emotion psychology.
Yeah, because emotions are not just fleeting feelings. They are highly potent neurological signals that drive decision-making, especially under stress.
Okay.
The analyses evaluate the system's behavior through the effect heuristic. This is a mental shortcut where people use their immediate gut emotional reaction to a stimulus to judge its actual risks and benefits.
So feeling equals fact.
Basically, yeah.
If something makes me feel anxious, it must objectively be dangerous. I think everyone listening has experienced this in the workplace.
Oh, for sure.
You send a perfectly normal email, but your boss is already stressed about a deadline, so they read your email through the lens of their anxiety. They use the affect heuristic, panic, and suddenly a routine update is treated like a 5-alarm fire.
That is the affect heuristic in action. Now scale that up to an institutional level.
Okay.
The authorities felt uncomfortable, anxious, and threatened by the mere existence of the content Dr. Chen was saving.
Just the existence of it.
Right. So instead of doing the math and calculating the actual probability of harm, which was practically zero, they bypassed logic entirely.
Oh.
Their collective anxiety dictated that because the content felt dangerous to their sense of order, it must instantly be labeled as a high-risk crime. The system's emotion became the literal substitute for objective legal evidence.
But then you look at Dr. Chen's emotional reaction to being put through this machine. The sources mentioned that while he was in prison, facing this overwhelming institutional anxiety, he wrote a blood letter of defense.
Yeah, a fascinating document.
And in this letter, he's not just crying out in despair or begging for mercy. He is pointing out judicial corruption using Gödel's incompleteness theorem and complex network topology.
Which is just incredible. For anyone unfamiliar with the math, Gödel's incompleteness theorem essentially proves that no complex logical system can prove its own consistency.
Okay.
There will always be true statements that the system itself cannot prove. Dr. Chen was mathematically demonstrating the logical flaws of the legal system that was trying to break him.
While sitting in a prison cell.
Yes. From a psychological standpoint, this is astounding. The analyses emphasize that Chen didn't suffer an emotional collapse. Instead, he utilized a highly advanced emotion regulation strategy called cognitive reappraisal.
He rewired how his brain processed the trauma.
Yes. He didn't just suppress his fear. I mean, suppression usually fails anyway. He entirely reframed his situation.
How so?
He reevaluated his imprisonment. It was no longer a meaningless, crushing personal tragedy. He decided it was a historical experiment.
Wow.
By doing this, he transformed the potential shame and helplessness of being locked in a cell into what psychologists call constructive anger and transcendent meaning.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
You're calling this a highly advanced strategy, almost like a superpower. But honestly, it sounds a bit like a desperate coping mechanism.
Fair point.
Is this really a victorious reframing? Or is he just building a massive mental fortress of physics and math so he doesn't completely lose his mind? Isn't he just hiding behind intellect to avoid facing sheer terror?
Well, the psychological consensus on that is it's both, and that's why it's brilliant.
Really?
Yeah. Drawing on Viktor Frankl's theories of meaning-making in extreme adversity, we know that constructing meaning is the ultimate psychological shield.
Okay.
Yes, it is a coping mechanism, but it is an incredibly adaptive and highly functional one. In an environment designed to strip away your autonomy, the brain's default reaction is learned helplessness.
Which is what?
The feeling that nothing you do matters, so you just give up. That helplessness is what destroys people mentally. By intellectually elevating his suffering into a data point for civilization, his cognitive reappraisal literally kept his identity intact. He maintained his internal locus of control when everything external was trying to erase it.
Wow. So his intellect wasn't just his hobby, it became his literal life raft. He survived by outthinking the trauma.
Exactly.
But the emotional state of the authorities didn't just affect how they treated Dr. Chen personally. The sources show that their reliance on emotion fundamentally corrupted the legal logic of the charge itself. Let's look at what the sources call the flawed emotion chain of the law.
This part is crucial.
The legal catch here is fascinating. To actually be guilty of the specific crime of picking quarrels and provoking trouble on the internet, the Chinese law requires concrete proof that the actions caused severe public disorder.
And this is where the psychological analyses completely dismantle the prosecution's case. The prosecution relied on a phantom emotion chain.
A phantom chain.
Yeah, their legal logic made a massive, unsupported triple jump. They assumed the retweeted post would trigger public negative emotion. They assumed that this emotion would rapidly spread across the population.
Right.
And finally, they assumed that this spread would automatically drive chaotic, disorderly behavior in the real physical world.
But the science of how emotion actually works completely defeats the charge.
Completely. Emotion psychology tells us that emotion is a social signal. For an emotion to spread and cause a panic, a phenomenon called emotional contagion, it requires a dense, highly connected network.
Imagine trying to start a stadium wave. If you have a packed stadium of 80,000 people standing shoulder to shoulder, the energy transfers instantly.
Right, everyone's connected.
You throw your hands up, the person next to you feels the energy and throws theirs up, and the wave goes around the arena. That is emotional contagion.
Great analogy.
But imagine trying to start that same wave with 3 people sitting in an otherwise completely empty stadium. You can throw your hands up and scream as loud as you want. The wave physically cannot happen. There's no network to carry it.
That is the perfect mechanical analogy for network topology. And the sources are incredibly specific about Dr. Chen's position in the digital network.
Where was he?
He was an isolated edge node. He had under 100 followers. The modeling suggests most of them were likely inactive accounts or zombies. He had 0 retweets on his comments.
Yeah.
He simply lacked the network density to trigger an emotional contagion. His actions were scientifically, mathematically incapable of causing the widespread chaos he was convicted for.
Think about your own social media feeds for a second, If you shout an opinion into an entirely empty digital room, can you be held legally responsible for starting a riot? The system essentially charged him for the potential of his thoughts.
It all circles back to the affect heuristic.
Yeah.
The authorities felt the symbolic threat of the idea. Their anxiety told them that the stadium was already in a full-blown riot, so they prosecuted him based on that feeling, completely ignoring the structural reality that he was standing in an empty room.
So what does this all mean? We've taken a massive deep dive into a very complex legal case, but we've looked at it entirely through the eyes of psychological modeling.
We really covered a lot of ground.
We did. We saw how a scientist's intrinsic curiosity, his epistemic motivation to just understand the world collided head-on with the system's extrinsic, fear-based need for control and cognitive closure.
We saw how the fundamental attribution error and the intense pain of cognitive dissonance forced officials to invent a monster out of a quiet academic.
Yeah. We saw how cognitive reappraisal, the ability to find meaning in suffering, saved a man's mind in an isolated prison cell. And finally, we saw how the law ultimately relied on a phantom emotion chain that completely defied the science of network topology and emotional contagion.
And, the reason this deep dive is so vital is that while you, listening to this, might not be facing a criminal trial, you are navigating these exact psychological mechanisms every single day.
Oh, definitely.
Understanding them is incredibly empowering. When you recognize that a boss, a partner, or a bureaucratic system is reacting out of an affect heuristic, when you see that they are judging a situation purely by their own anxiety rather than objective reality, you can change how you respond.
You stop taking it personally.
Exactly. When you realize someone is projecting their own extrinsic anxieties onto your intrinsic motivations, you can navigate that conflict with much more clarity.
That's huge.
And perhaps most importantly, in your own moments of crisis, recognizing the power of cognitive reappraisal, knowing that you have the internal ability to reframe your own narrative, well, that can help you protect your mental integrity when things get tough.
It really does change how you view the world around you. I want to leave you with a final lingering question to ponder as you go about your day. We talked at the very beginning about looking at a map that doesn't make sense,
Mm.
like a compass spinning wildly in a magnetic storm.
Yeah.
If a massive, powerful institution relies entirely on extrinsic, fear-based motivations to maintain its order, and if it automatically criminalizes intrinsic, curiosity-driven behavior because it cannot understand it, what is the long-term cost?
That's the real question.
Does a system that meticulously hunts down and punishes its most curious edge nodes eventually blind itself to the very innovation, the very adaptability it needs to survive the future? Keep that in mind next time you see a compass spinning. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us today.